The sound of my husband's laughter echoing through our living room should have filled me with joy on our 25th wedding anniversary. Instead, his words turned my blood to ice. I've been cheating for years, and she hasn't realized a single thing. That moment, standing frozen in my own hallway with anniversary flowers in my hands, became the dividing line between the woman I was and the woman I would become. My name is Margaret Thompson, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 52 years old, and until that Tuesday afternoon in October 2024, I believed I had a solid marriage with Robert Thompson, my husband of 25 years. We live in a comfortable 2-story house in Charlotte, North Carolina, where Bob runs a construction consulting firm with his business partner, James Mitchell. I work part-time as a bookkeeper for a local dental practice, which gives me flexibility to manage our household and pursue my gardening hobby. That particular Tuesday started like any other anniversary. I woke up early, made Bob's favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup, and left a card on his coffee mug. He seemed distracted, barely acknowledging the gesture before rushing out to what he claimed was an important client meeting. I remember feeling slightly disappointed, but dismissed it as work stress. After all, 25 years of marriage teaches you to overlook small slights. My plan was simple. Surprise him by coming home early from work with his favorite Chinese takeout and the bottle of wine we'd been saving. I'd arranged with Dr. Peterson to leave at 3 instead of 5, giving me time to stop by Golden Dragon Restaurant and pick up sweet and sour chicken, beef lo mein, and those pork dumplings Bob always orders. The wine, a 2018 Cabernet Sauvignon from our trip to Napa Valley 3 years ago, waited in our basement wine rack for the perfect occasion. Driving home with the warm containers filling my car with familiar aromas, I felt genuinely excited. Perhaps we'd lost some romance over the years, but I still loved this man who'd been my partner through graduate school, career changes, and the heartbreak of infertility. We'd built a life together, traveled to Europe twice, renovated our kitchen, and supported each other through his father's death and my mother's battle with Alzheimer's. I pulled into our driveway at 3:45, noting Bob's silver Ford F-150 parked in its usual spot. Strange. He'd mentioned the client meeting would run until at least 5. Maybe it ended early, I thought, fumbling with my keys while balancing the food containers. The October air carried the scent of burning leaves from somewhere in our neighborhood, and Mrs. Henderson's chrysanthemums were reaching peak bloom across the street. As I approached our front door, I heard Bob's voice through the slightly open living room window. He was laughing, that deep, genuine laugh I'd fallen in love with in college. My heart warmed, thinking he might be sharing good news about a contract or joking with James about some work situation. I paused, key halfway to the lock, planning to listen for a moment and gauge his mood before my surprise entrance. "You should see her face when she tries to balance the checkbook," Bob was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the autumn air. 25 years, and she still thinks I'm just bad with money. Meanwhile, I'm spending $3,000 a month on your apartment, and she hasn't figured out a damn thing. The takeout containers slipped from my suddenly nerveless fingers, landing with a soft thud on our welcome mat. Sweet and sour sauce began seeping through the paper bag, creating a dark stain that would later remind me of this exact moment every time I walked through our front door. "The best part," Bob continued, his laughter now sounding cruel to my ears, "is how grateful she gets when I remember our anniversary. Like buying her flowers once a year makes up for all the business trips to see you. God, Sandra, if she only knew half the places we've been together while she's at home organizing my sock drawer." Sandra. The name hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard Bob mention a Sandra Williams from his networking group, but she was supposed to be just another business contact. My legs felt unsteady as fragments of conversations began reassembling in my mind with new, terrible clarity. "She actually thanked me last week for working so hard to provide for us." Bob's voice carried on, each word cutting deeper. "If working hard means spending weekends at your beach house while she thinks I'm reviewing blueprints, then sure, I'm Employee of the Year. 25 years of marriage tomorrow, and she's making me pancakes like a good little wife while I'm planning to celebrate with you instead." I stood there paralyzed, one hand still clutching my car keys, the other pressed against our front door for support. The woman he was describing, grateful, naive, oblivious, was that really me? Had I been so blind, so willingly ignorant, that my husband could maintain a full relationship with another woman while I celebrated our quarter-century of marriage? The rational part of my mind cataloged details: $3,000 monthly, a beach house, business trips that weren't business, networking events that were apparently something else entirely. But the emotional part was drowning in a mixture of humiliation, rage, and disbelief that made it difficult to breathe. 25 years, 9,131 days of marriage, thousands of meals cooked, loads of laundry folded, evenings spent listening to his work stories, vacations planned around his schedule. How many of those business dinners had been dates with Sandra? How many late nights at the office had been spent in her apartment that I was apparently helping to pay for? As Bob's laughter continued to drift through our window, I realized that the woman who'd woken up that morning planning a quiet anniversary celebration was gone forever. Standing on my own front porch with Chinese food soaking through a paper bag at my feet, I began to understand that sometimes the most devastating betrayals come wrapped in ordinary Tuesday afternoons, delivered in the voice of someone you thought you knew completely. I didn't go inside that day. Instead, I gathered the scattered takeout containers, drove to the park 6 blocks away, and sat in my car until Bob's usual arrival time. When I finally returned home, I found him in the kitchen, whistling while opening a beer, acting as if nothing had happened. He kissed my cheek and asked about my day with such practiced normalcy that I almost questioned whether I'd imagined the entire conversation. "Sorry about dinner," I managed to say, my voice surprisingly steady. "I got held up at work and didn't have time to cook." The lie came easily, the first of many I would tell over the coming weeks. "No problem, sweetheart," Bob replied, already reaching for his phone. "I'll order pizza. James wants to discuss that Henderson project anyway, so I might step outside to take his call." I watched him dial, wondering if James Mitchell even existed on the other end of that conversation, or if it was Sandra Williams receiving another call from my husband in our kitchen. Every gesture, every word, every casual deception now carried weight I'd never noticed before. That night, Bob made love to me with an enthusiasm I'd attributed to anniversary sentiment. Now I wondered whose body he was really imagining, whose techniques he'd learned from afternoon encounters I'd unknowingly funded. I lay awake afterward, studying his sleeping face in the moonlight, trying to reconcile this stranger with the man I'd shared a bed with for over 2 decades. The next morning began my careful excavation of 25 years of marriage. While Bob showered, I opened his laptop using the password we'd always shared, our wedding date. His browser history had been cleared, but his email revealed a pattern I'd been too trusting to notice. Messages from Mitchell Construction Services appeared frequently, but when I clicked on the address, it belonged to Swilliams, contractingplus.com. Sandra Williams had been hiding in plain sight, disguised as business correspondence. The messages were coded but unmistakable once I understood the language. Meeting confirmed for Friday at the usual location meant afternoons at her apartment. Project materials ready for pickup referred to intimate encounters I couldn't bear to imagine in detail. Invoice attached accompanied receipts for dinners at restaurants Bob had never taken me to, wine tastings in towns he'd claimed to visit for work, hotel rooms in Charlotte when we lived 30 minutes away. I printed everything, creating a folder I hid behind my gardening magazines in the spare bedroom. Each piece of evidence felt like swallowing glass, but I forced myself to continue. If 25 years had taught me anything, it was attention to detail. The same skill that made me an excellent bookkeeper would now document the destruction of my marriage. Bank statements revealed the financial architecture of Bob's double life. Regular withdrawals of $600 every Friday, categorized as business lunches in our budget spreadsheets. Monthly payments of $3,050 to Riverside Property Management, a company that didn't exist in any Charlotte business directory I could find. Credit card charges at Victoria's Secret during months when he'd given me nothing, jewelry purchases from stores I'd never visited, spa treatments, and weekend getaways that had supposedly been fishing trips with college friends. The fishing trips. I pulled out our photo albums, studying pictures Bob had brought back from these monthly excursions. Generic lake scenes that could have been taken anywhere, fish he claimed to have caught but never cleaned at home, stories about friends I'd never met, despite 25 years of marriage. Now I realized why he'd always returned from these trips, tanned and relaxed, smelling faintly of expensive perfume. He claimed came from the bait shop. I called the phone numbers of his supposed fishing buddies, men he'd mentioned casually over the years. 3 had moved away from Charlotte more than 5 years ago. 2 had never heard of Bob Thompson. 1 hung up when I mentioned fishing trips, muttering something about not wanting to get involved. The evidence painted a picture of elaborate deception that required planning, creativity, and a complete disregard for my feelings or intelligence. During this period, I maintained perfect normalcy. I cooked his meals, did his laundry, listened to his fabricated stories about client meetings and project deadlines. But now, I was observing, cataloging, learning the rhythm of his lies. When he claimed late nights at the office, I drove by his building and found it dark. When he mentioned client dinners, I checked credit card statements and found charges at intimate restaurants for 2 people during times when he should have been networking. The most painful discovery came on a Thursday afternoon when I found a second cell phone hidden in his golf bag. The device contained months of text messages with Sandra, photos I couldn't look at for more than seconds, and a calendar showing their appointments scheduled around my work shifts at Dr. Peterson's office. They knew my schedule better than I knew theirs. One message from Sandra made my stomach turn. Can't wait for this weekend at the beach house. I bought that wine you like, and I'll wear the necklace you gave me for my birthday. Bob had claimed to be attending a construction conference in Raleigh that weekend. I'd encouraged him to go, even packed his suitcase with clean shirts and the cologne I'd given him for Christmas. The beach house, $3,000 a month, suddenly made sense. They were sharing rent on a coastal property where they played house while I managed our actual home. I researched oceanfront rentals in North Carolina and found properties matching the amount. Wrightsville Beach, Ocean Isle, Sunset Beach, places Bob and I had never visited together because he claimed to dislike sand and salt water. I began tracking his patterns more systematically. Tuesday afternoon, client meetings that lasted until evening. Thursday, networking events that never seemed to generate new business. Weekend fishing trips that happened precisely every 3rd Saturday. Sandra's work schedule, based on her email patterns, aligned perfectly with Bob's absences from home. The cruelest part was realizing how considerate they'd been of my feelings while destroying my life. They'd scheduled their relationship around my routine, ensuring I never felt neglected or suspicious. Bob brought me flowers after weekend getaways with Sandra, took me to dinner, following afternoons in her apartment, made love to me with passion borrowed from another woman's bed. 3 weeks into my investigation, I discovered the financial crisis Bob had hidden. His business accounts showed mounting debts, missed payments, and increasingly desperate measures to maintain cash flow. The same credit cards funding Sandra's apartment and their beach house weekends were maxed out with business expenses. Invoices piled up unpaid while Bob diverted company funds to maintain his double life. I realized why he'd seemed distracted lately, why he'd been drinking more wine at dinner, why he'd started talking about restructuring the business and economic challenges in construction. Bob wasn't just cheating on me, he was financially destroying us to pay for the privilege. The $3,000 monthly for Sandra's apartment, the weekend trips, the expensive gifts and dinners were bleeding our accounts dry while he smiled and asked me to manage our household budget more carefully. By the end of October, I possessed a complete picture of my husband's betrayal. 25 years of marriage had been a facade hiding a man I'd never really known. But more importantly, I'd learned something about myself during those weeks of silent investigation. I was stronger, smarter, and more capable than either Bob or Sandra imagined. They'd underestimated the woman who kept their secret safe while gathering ammunition for a war they didn't know was coming. As November approached, I prepared for the next phase of my new life. The evidence was collected, the patterns documented, and my resolve hardened into something Bob would never recognize in the grateful wife who'd thanked him for working so hard to provide for us. The first Monday in November, I made an appointment with Catherine Hayes, a divorce attorney whose office sat 3 blocks from Dr. Peterson's dental practice. I'd walked past her building hundreds of times over the years, never imagining I'd need her services. Catherine was a woman in her early 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail as I spread my evidence across her mahogany desk. 25 years, she said quietly, reviewing the bank statements and printed emails. And you've documented everything in just 3 weeks. Most clients take months to gather this level of detail. She looked up from the papers. You understand that North Carolina is an equitable distribution state, not a 50-50 split. The court considers multiple factors, including marital misconduct. I nodded, though my hands trembled slightly as she explained the legal process. My concern isn't just the divorce, I told her. His business is failing, and I suspect he's been using marital assets to fund his affair. I need to protect what's mine before creditors come calling. Catherine's expression grew more serious as she reviewed Bob's business finances. These numbers are troubling. The company shows significant debt, and if he's commingled personal and business funds inappropriately, you could be liable for business debts. We need to act quickly to separate your assets and establish a timeline of financial misconduct. She recommended I immediately open individual accounts at a different bank, document all personal property purchased with my income, and establish a paper trail showing which assets predated the affair. Don't move any money yet, she warned. We need to be strategic about timing to avoid accusations of hiding assets. But prepare everything so we can act swiftly when the moment is right. That afternoon, I visited First National Bank across town, where I'd maintained a small savings account since college, money Bob knew nothing about. Over the years, I'd occasionally deposited birthday checks from my parents, small bonuses from Dr. Peterson, and cash from selling my handmade jewelry at craft fairs. The account held nearly $12,000, a modest emergency fund I'd never mentioned to Bob because he tended to view any money as available for his business needs. The bank manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, helped me understand the process of separating finances during a divorce. She recommended I gather documentation of all joint accounts, investments, and property, then work with my attorney to determine the safest way to protect my individual assets. The key, she explained, is transparency with the court while protecting yourself from your spouse's financial irresponsibility. I spent the following week photographing every valuable item in our house: my grandmother's china, jewelry Bob had given me over the years, artwork we'd purchased together, and the antique furniture I'd inherited from my parents. Each photo was dated and stored in a secure digital folder, creating an inventory that would prove ownership and value if assets disappeared during divorce proceedings. The most challenging task was accessing Bob's business records without arousing suspicion. I knew he kept files in our home office, but he'd grown protective of that space recently, often working with the door closed and password-protecting documents he'd previously left open. My opportunity came when he announced another fishing trip, scheduled for the second weekend in November. James found this incredible spot near Lake Norman, Bob explained, packing his gear Friday evening. We might stay an extra day if the fish are biting. He kissed my forehead with practiced affection. Don't wait up tomorrow night. You know how these trips go. I did know, though not in the way he imagined. After his truck disappeared down our street, I settled into his office chair and began a systematic search through his computer files, desk drawers, and filing cabinets. What I discovered exceeded my worst fears about the company's financial condition. Thompson Mitchell Construction had been operating in the red for over 18 months. Outstanding invoices totaled nearly $80,000, while accounts payable exceeded $120,000. Bob had been juggling payments, borrowing against business credit lines, and deferring tax obligations to maintain the appearance of solvency. Most disturbingly, he'd taken cash advances against our home equity line of credit to cover business expenses, money that legally belonged to both of us but was now tied up in a failing enterprise. The paper trail showed how Sandra's apartment and their shared expenses had accelerated the business collapse. Rather than cutting personal spending when cash flow problems began, Bob had increased his affair-related expenses. Credit card statements revealed weekend trips to Asheville, expensive dinners in downtown Charlotte, jewelry purchases that coincided with Sandra's birthday and their apparent anniversary dates. I photographed every document, creating a comprehensive record of how Bob had prioritized his relationship with Sandra over our financial security. The evidence showed clear financial misconduct, using marital assets and business funds to support an extramarital affair while hiding the company's deteriorating condition from his wife and business partner. Sunday evening, I called my friend Ellen Martinez, who worked as a forensic accountant for a Charlotte law firm. Ellen and I had maintained our friendship since college, bonding over our shared love of numbers and detail-oriented work. She'd helped me understand complex financial documents before when I'd considered investing our retirement savings. "Maggie, these numbers are devastating," Ellen said after reviewing the documents I'd scanned and emailed. "He's essentially been embezzling from his own company to fund an affair, then covering the shortfalls with personal debt secured by your house. If the business fails, creditors could potentially claim your home as collateral." She recommended I immediately consult with Catherine Hayes about filing for legal separation to protect my assets before Bob's financial house of cards collapsed completely. "You need court orders establishing separate property and preventing him from incurring additional debt in your name. This isn't just about divorce anymore. It's about financial survival." That realization crystallized my resolve. For weeks, I'd focused on the emotional betrayal, the hurt of discovering my husband's double life. Now I understood that Bob hadn't just broken our marriage vows. He jeopardized my financial future to pay for the privilege. The same man who'd asked me to clip coupons and shop sales had been spending thousands monthly on another woman while driving our family toward bankruptcy. I scheduled an emergency meeting with Catherine Hayes for Monday morning, armed with evidence of Bob's financial misconduct and a clearer understanding of what I needed to protect. My modest savings account, my inheritance from my parents, my jewelry and personal belongings, even my small retirement account from Dr. Peterson's office. Everything I'd built independently was at risk if I didn't act decisively. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Bob spent the weekend at Sandra's beach house celebrating their relationship with money that belonged to both of us, I was home planning the legal strategy that would end his access to our joint assets. He'd underestimated my intelligence for 25 years, assuming I was too trusting or naive to uncover his deceptions. Now his assumption would cost him everything he'd taken for granted. As I prepared for Monday's meeting with Catherine, I felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement. Fear of the unknown future ahead, but excitement about reclaiming control over my life and finances. For the first time in weeks, I was moving from passive discovery to active planning. Bob had spent years constructing his elaborate deception, but I'd spent 3 weeks building the foundation for his downfall. The man who returned Sunday night, smiling and relaxed from his fishing trip, had no idea that his carefully maintained double life was about to collide with his wife's newfound determination to protect herself from the wreckage he'd created. Monday morning arrived with the kind of November chill that makes you grateful for warm coffee and heated cars. I sat in Catherine Hayes' office at 8:30 sharp, watching her review the weekend's discoveries with growing concern. The forensic accounting report from Ellen Martinez lay spread across her desk alongside Bob's business records, creating a damning portrait of financial recklessness disguised as marital devotion. "We need to move immediately," Catherine said, her voice carrying the urgency I'd hoped to hear. "Based on these documents, your husband has been systematically depleting marital assets to fund his affair while his business spirals toward bankruptcy. Every day we delay increases your exposure to his creditors." She outlined our strategy with military precision. First, we'd file for legal separation that afternoon, requesting immediate court orders to prevent Bob from accessing or disposing of joint assets. Second, I'd transfer my personal funds to protected accounts before he realized what was happening. Third, we'd document and remove my individual property from the house before creditors could claim it as business collateral. "The timing is crucial," Catherine explained. "North Carolina law allows you to protect assets you brought to the marriage and property purchased with your separate funds, but only if we can prove ownership and act before his business debts overwhelm everything. You have perhaps 48 hours before word spreads about his financial condition. I left her office with a detailed action plan and a strange sense of calm. After weeks of feeling powerless while uncovering Bob's betrayals, I finally had concrete steps to protect myself. The woman who'd stood paralyzed on her front porch with Chinese takeout was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival sometimes requires swift, decisive action. My first stop was Mechanics and Farmers Bank, where I opened 2 new accounts, checking and savings, in my name only. I transferred the $12,000 from my old individual account, then added another $8,000 from a certificate of deposit my parents had given me for my 50th birthday. Bob had never known about either account, viewing my finances as an extension of his own rather than recognizing my independent financial identity. Next, I visited Safe Harbor Storage on the outskirts of Charlotte, renting a climate-controlled unit large enough to hold furniture and boxes. The facility offered 24-hour access and security cameras, important features for someone planning to move valuable items without her husband's knowledge. I paid 6 months in advance using cash from my new checking account, ensuring no paper trail would lead Bob to my temporary sanctuary. Tuesday evening, while Bob attended what he claimed was a client dinner with potential investors, I began the delicate process of removing my personal belongings from our house. I started with items he'd never notice: photo albums from my childhood, jewelry from my grandmother, my collection of first edition gardening books, the handmade quilt my mother had given me when I graduated college. Each item carried memories of my life before Bob, reminders of the woman I'd been when we met, and the family who'd shaped my values. As I carefully wrapped my grandmother's crystal vase in bubble wrap, I realized I wasn't just protecting objects. I was reclaiming pieces of my identity that had been overshadowed by 25 years of trying to be the perfect wife for an imperfect husband. Wednesday brought news that accelerated my timeline dramatically. Dr. Peterson mentioned during lunch that he'd heard rumors about construction companies struggling in Charlotte's competitive market. "Word is, some of the smaller firms are having cash flow problems," he said casually while reviewing patient files. "Real estate development has slowed, and contractors are fighting for fewer projects." That afternoon, I called Ellen Martinez to update her on my progress and ask about the broader construction industry situation. Her news confirmed my worst fears. "I've been tracking several construction companies for clients involved in litigation," she explained. "The market downtown has been particularly brutal. Companies that were thriving 2 years ago are filing for bankruptcy or dissolving partnerships to avoid personal liability." She paused before delivering the blow I'd been dreading. "Maggie, based on the financial documents you showed me, Thompson Mitchell Construction fits the profile of companies that fail suddenly and dramatically. If Bob hasn't told his business partner about the true financial condition, James Mitchell might force bankruptcy proceedings to protect his personal assets." I realized that Bob's recent client dinners and investor meetings were probably desperate attempts to secure funding or negotiate payment extensions with creditors. His cheerful demeanor at home was a performance designed to hide the approaching financial catastrophe that would destroy everything we'd built together. Thursday morning, I took a personal day from Dr. Peterson's office and executed the most challenging part of my plan. Using Bob's Thursday routine of leaving early for his supposed networking breakfast, I hired 2 men from a local moving company to help me relocate furniture and larger items to my storage unit. I'd chosen pieces carefully: the antique dining set my parents had given us as a wedding gift, the bedroom furniture I'd inherited from my grandmother, artwork I'd purchased with my own money over the years. The movers, professional and discreet, completed the job in 3 hours. I left enough furniture to make the house appear normal at first glance, but removed anything with significant personal or financial value. Bob's tendency to ignore domestic details worked in my favor. He might not notice missing items for days or weeks. I spent Thursday afternoon at Catherine's office finalizing the legal separation paperwork and reviewing our strategy for serving Bob with documents. We decided to wait until his business situation reached a crisis point, using his financial desperation to strengthen our position in divorce negotiations. Men like your husband often react poorly when they realize they've lost control, Catherine warned. He's been manipulating the situation for years, assuming you'd never discover his deceptions or challenge his authority. When he understands that you've outmaneuvered him, he may become aggressive or vindictive. She recommended I prepare for potential retaliation by documenting any threats or unusual behavior, keeping copies of all important documents in secure locations, and maintaining detailed records of our communications. The goal is to protect yourself legally and emotionally while giving him as little ammunition as possible for counterattacks. Friday afternoon brought the call I'd been expecting. James Mitchell phoned our house, his voice tense and urgent when I answered. "Maggie, is Bob there? We've got a serious problem with the Henderson project, and I can't reach him on his cell phone." "He's at a client meeting," I replied smoothly, though I suspected Bob was actually at Sandra's apartment for their usual Friday afternoon rendezvous. "Can I take a message?" James hesitated before speaking. "Tell him the client is threatening to pull out of the contract. They're questioning our ability to complete the work, and frankly, I'm starting to have the same concerns. We need to talk immediately about our financial position and whether we can continue operating." After hanging up, I sat in our kitchen surrounded by the remnants of our shared life, understanding that the crisis I'd been preparing for was about to arrive. Bob's business was collapsing faster than even I had anticipated, and his partner was demanding answers Bob couldn't provide without revealing the extent of his financial misconduct. That evening, Bob returned home later than usual, his face showing stress he could no longer hide completely. He claimed the client meeting had run long, but I noticed his hands shaking slightly as he opened a beer and avoided eye contact during dinner conversation. "Everything all right at work?" I asked innocently, watching him carefully for signs of the desperation I knew he must be feeling. "Just the usual challenges," he replied with forced casualness. "Construction is a tough business, but we've weathered storms before. James worries too much about every little setback." I nodded sympathetically while calculating how many lies he'd told in that brief exchange. The man sitting across from me had spent years perfecting the art of deception, but stress was finally cracking his carefully maintained facade. Soon, he'd have to choose between confessing his failures to me or watching his entire world collapse without warning. As I cleared the dinner dishes, I felt a mixture of anticipation and sadness. 25 years of marriage were ending not with romantic reconciliation or mutual understanding, but with strategic maneuvering and legal protection. The wife Bob had taken for granted was about to become an adversary he'd never see coming. The moment of reckoning arrived on a gray Tuesday morning in mid-November, delivered by James Mitchell standing on our front porch with a manila envelope and devastated expression. I answered the door in my bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, playing the role of unsuspecting wife perfectly while my heart raced with anticipation. "Maggie, I need to speak with Bob urgently," James said, his voice strained. "The bank called this morning. They're freezing our business accounts pending a review of outstanding loans. We have creditors demanding payment by Friday, and I just discovered Bob hasn't been completely honest about our financial position." I invited him in, maintaining my facade of confusion while internally celebrating the timing. Bob had left an hour earlier for what he claimed was an early appointment with a potential client, though his Tuesday morning pattern suggested he was actually meeting Sandra for their weekly breakfast at the Omni Hotel. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," I said, settling James at our kitchen table and refilling his coffee mug. "Bob mentioned the construction market was challenging, but he seemed confident about our position. What exactly did the bank tell you?" James pulled documents from his envelope with shaking hands. "Thompson Mitchell Construction owes nearly $200,000 across multiple creditors. Our checking account has been overdrawn for 3 weeks, covered only by automatic transfers from a business line of credit that's now maxed out. Worse, Bob apparently signed personal guarantees using his home as collateral without consulting me." He looked up from the papers with genuine anguish. "Maggie, I trusted him to handle the financial side while I managed project operations. I had no idea he'd been juggling payments and borrowing against personal assets. If we can't resolve this immediately, we're facing bankruptcy, and you could lose your house." I let appropriate shock register on my face while calculating how to use this information most effectively. James Mitchell was clearly innocent of Bob's financial machinations, making him a potential ally rather than an enemy. More importantly, his revelation about the personal guarantees confirmed my worst suspicions about how deeply Bob had compromised our assets. "James, I think you need to know something," I said carefully, testing how much I could reveal without exposing my weeks of investigation. "Bob has been secretive about business matters lately, working odd hours and taking calls he claimed were confidential client discussions. I've been wondering if there were problems he wasn't sharing." James nodded grimly. "I confronted our bookkeeper yesterday. She admitted Bob instructed her to delay entering certain expenses and to categorize personal withdrawals as business costs. She was afraid to question him because he'd been increasingly volatile about financial discussions." The picture was completing itself perfectly. Bob's desperation had made him careless, leaving a trail of witnesses who could testify to his misconduct. His affair with Sandra hadn't just been a personal betrayal. It had become the financial catalyst that would expose his professional failures to business partners, creditors, and ultimately, divorce courts. "What happens now?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from my consultations with Catherine Hayes. "I'm filing papers to dissolve the partnership and protect my personal assets," James replied. "Bob can fight me in court, but given what I've discovered about his financial management, I doubt any judge would force me to remain liable for debts I didn't authorize. I'm sorry, Maggie, but you need to protect yourself immediately." After James left, I called Catherine's office from my cell phone, knowing our landline might be monitored if Bob had grown suspicious of my activities. Her assistant scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon, setting in motion the confrontation I'd been preparing for since October. Bob returned home at noon, his cheerful demeanor noticeably forced as he kissed my cheek and asked about my morning. "James stopped by," I said casually, watching his face carefully. "He seemed upset about something involving the bank and business accounts." "He mentioned you'd guaranteed loans using our house?" Bob's smile faltered for just a moment before recovering. "James panics over routine business matters. The bank is just reviewing our credit lines as part of their annual process. Nothing to worry about, sweetheart. These things always work themselves out." I nodded as if satisfied by his explanation while noting how easily he continued lying even as his world crumbled around him. The man who'd spent 25 years claiming to protect and provide for me was still trying to shield me from consequences of decisions that could cost us everything we owned. That afternoon, Catherine Hayes reviewed James Mitchell's information and confirmed our strategy needed immediate implementation. "Your husband's business partner is forcing his hand by filing dissolution papers. Bob will have 72 hours to respond, during which time his personal assets remain vulnerable to business creditors. We need to serve him with separation papers immediately." She'd prepared everything for rapid execution: legal documents establishing my separate property rights, court orders preventing Bob from disposing of joint assets, and a comprehensive filing that would protect my individual accounts and belongings from his business debts. "The beauty of this timing," Catherine explained, "is that his business crisis will overshadow the personal crisis. He'll be fighting multiple legal battles simultaneously, reducing his ability to focus on hiding assets or mounting effective counterattacks against the divorce proceedings." I chose to confront Bob that evening, after he'd had time to fully absorb the implications of James's partnership dissolution. He arrived home at 6:30, carrying takeout Chinese food, an ironic echo of the afternoon I'd discovered his affair. His stress was now clearly visible in the tight lines around his eyes and the way he avoided sustained eye contact. "We need to talk," I said, as he unpacked sweet and sour chicken and beef lo mein. "James told me about the business problems, and I think it's time we discussed what this means for our finances and our marriage." Bob set down the containers slowly, his shoulders sagging as if he'd been carrying invisible weight for months. "Maggie, the construction business has been brutal lately. James is overreacting to temporary cash flow issues that every company faces during market downturns. Yes, we've had to be creative with financing, but—" "Stop lying to me, Robert," I interrupted, using his full name for the first time in years. "I know about Sandra Williams. I know about the apartment you're paying for, The beach house weekends, the $3,000 monthly you've been spending on your affair while telling me we need to budget more carefully. The color drained from his face as if I'd physically struck him. He gripped the kitchen counter, staring at me with genuine shock that his carefully constructed deception had been discovered. "How long have you known?" he whispered. "Since our anniversary," I replied steadily. "I heard you laughing about how I hadn't realized anything while you planned to celebrate 25 years of marriage with another woman. I've spent the last month documenting your financial misconduct, consulting attorneys, and protecting the assets you've been using to fund your double life." Bob's shock transformed into desperate calculation as he realized the extent of his exposure. "Maggie, you don't understand the pressure I've been under. The business problem started before Sandra, and I was trying to protect you from the stress. Yes, I made mistakes, but we can work through this together. I'll end things with her immediately." I pulled the manila envelope containing separation papers from the kitchen drawer where I'd hidden them that morning. "It's too late for promises, Bob. James is dissolving your partnership. Creditors are demanding payment on loans you guaranteed with our house, and I've learned you've been embezzling from your own company to pay for your affair. I'm filing for legal separation to protect myself from the financial disaster you've created." His desperation shifted to anger as the full implications became clear. "You can't leave me now, not when I need your support most. We built this life together, and you can't just walk away when things get difficult." "We didn't build anything together," I replied, sliding the separation papers across our kitchen table. "You built a facade while systematically destroying our marriage and finances to pay for your relationship with Sandra. I'm not walking away from difficulties. I'm protecting myself from the consequences of your choices." Bob read the documents with growing fury, his face reddening as he realized how thoroughly I'd outmaneuvered him. "You've been planning this for weeks while pretending to be my supportive wife. You're just as deceptive as you claim I am." "The difference," I said quietly, "is that my deception was designed to protect myself from your betrayal, while yours was designed to betray me for your own pleasure. Sign the papers, Bob. Fighting me will only make things worse for both of us." As Bob sat at our kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of his failures and faced with the collapse of everything he'd taken for granted, I realized that the woman who'd stood frozen on her front porch 6 weeks earlier had been reborn as someone he'd never expected to face across a battlefield of his own making. 3 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new apartment in Myers Park, watching snow fall gently outside while my morning coffee brewed. The silence was profound. No television news Bob insisted on during breakfast, no hurried conversations about his day's appointments, no underlying tension about money or schedules or the thousand small deceptions that had poisoned our daily life together. The divorce proceedings had unfolded exactly as Catherine Hayes predicted. Bob's initial fury gave way to desperate bargaining as the full scope of his financial collapse became public knowledge. Thompson Mitchell Construction officially filed for bankruptcy in December, with James Mitchell successfully separating his assets, while Bob faced personal liability for debts he'd guaranteed without proper authorization. The beach house lease was terminated. Sandra Williams apparently decided that a bankrupt man held less appeal than a successful one, and Bob found himself alone with the consequences of 25 years of choices. I'd been remarkably fortunate in the final settlement. My advance preparation paid dividends when Bob's attorneys discovered how thoroughly I'd documented his financial misconduct and protected my separate property. Rather than face a protracted court battle that would expose his affair and embezzlement to public scrutiny, Bob agreed to a settlement that left me with my retirement accounts, the antique furniture now stored in my new home, and enough assets to purchase this modest 2-bedroom apartment with cash. The house we'd shared for 15 years went into foreclosure, as expected. Bob moved into a rental apartment across town, working for a larger construction firm as a project manager at a fraction of his former income. I occasionally heard updates through Charlotte's close-knit professional community. He'd aged dramatically, developed health problems stress-related, and seemed isolated from the social circles where we'd once been welcomed as a couple. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet sense of justice served. The man who'd laughed about my naivety while planning to celebrate our anniversary with his mistress had learned that underestimating someone for 25 years can be a costly mistake. My new life surprised me with its richness. Working full-time for Dr. Peterson again provided structure and purpose, while evenings belonged entirely to me for the first time since college. I'd joined a book club, started taking watercolor painting classes at the community center, and cultivated friendships with women who knew nothing about my former marriage or the dramatic circumstances of its ending. The financial security I'd fought to protect allowed me simple luxuries I'd forgotten during years of careful budgeting designed to accommodate Bob's hidden expenses. Fresh flowers for my apartment every week. Dinners at restaurants I chose based on my preferences rather than his. A small vacation to visit my sister in Colorado without consulting anyone's schedule but my own. Most importantly, I'd reclaimed my sense of self-worth. The woman who'd thanked Bob for working hard to provide for us had been replaced by someone who understood her own value and refused to accept less than honest treatment from anyone in her life. Dating held no appeal yet. Perhaps it never would. But solitude felt like luxury rather than loneliness. Ellen Martinez visited regularly, bringing wine and gossip about Charlotte's legal community. She'd helped me understand the forensic accounting evidence that proved Bob's financial misconduct, testimony that strengthened my position immeasurably during settlement negotiations. You saved yourself probably $50,000 in legal fees by doing such thorough investigation work, she told me one evening. Most people wait until after they hire attorneys to start gathering evidence. I'd also maintained an unexpected friendship with James Mitchell, who'd successfully rebuilt his construction business under a new name. He'd sent a Christmas card acknowledging that my warning about Bob's problems had helped him act quickly enough to preserve his professional reputation and personal assets. I should have paid more attention to the signs, he wrote. You were more observant about your own husband's character than his business partner. The psychological healing had taken longer than the legal resolution. Months passed before I stopped automatically checking my phone for text messages that would never come, before I could hear certain songs on the radio without remembering happier times that I now knew were built on lies, before I could trust my judgment about people and situations again. Dr. Peterson had been particularly supportive during the transition period, allowing me flexible scheduling when court appointments conflicted with work hours and never prying into personal details while making clear his concern for my welfare. 25 years is a significant portion of anyone's life, he observed during one of our lunch conversations. But you're 52, not 92. There's plenty of time to build something better. He was right, though I hadn't initially believed it. The woman who'd spent her anniversary discovering betrayal couldn't imagine feeling grateful for that painful revelation. But time had provided perspective about the gift hidden in that devastating moment. Learning the truth about Bob's character had freed me from a marriage that was slowly draining my spirit, while convincing me I was fortunate to have such a devoted husband. Now I understood that devotion built on deception was worthless, that financial security based on hidden debt was illusion, that gratitude for table scraps was unnecessary when I could provide my own feast. Bob had spent years teaching me to expect less, while he gave his best efforts to another woman, but his betrayal had inadvertently taught me to demand more from everyone, including myself. On quiet evenings in my apartment, I sometimes wondered what would have happened if I'd never heard that phone conversation, never discovered Sandra Williams, never investigated the financial discrepancies that revealed Bob's double life. Would I have continued managing household budgets while he drained our accounts for his affair? Would I have thanked him for 26th and 27th anniversaries while he laughed with Sandra about my continued naivety? The questions held academic interest, but no regret. Some people spend their entire lives married to strangers, never quite understanding why intimacy feels elusive or why promises seem hollow. I'd been granted the painful gift of seeing clearly, of understanding exactly whom I'd been living with and what my alternatives truly were. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came unexpected opportunities. Dr. Peterson offered me a position managing finances for a new practice he was opening with 2 younger dentists. The work would be challenging and well compensated, requiring skills I'd developed through years of careful bookkeeping, but never fully utilized professionally. I accepted the position, understanding that financial independence was both practical necessity and symbolic victory. The woman who discovered her husband's betrayal by accident was becoming someone who created her own security through competence and careful planning rather than depending on anyone else's promises. As I write this, 6 months after Bob signed our divorce papers in Catherine Hayes's office, I realized that the most profound transformation wasn't in my external circumstances, but in my internal landscape. The gratitude I'd once felt for small considerations from an unfaithful husband has been replaced by appreciation for my own strength, intelligence, and capacity for rebuilding. I've learned that some marriages end with explosive arguments and dramatic confrontations, while others dissolve through quiet recognition that love built on lies cannot sustain honest people. My 25-year marriage ended not when Bob moved out of our house, but when I heard him laughing about deceiving me and decided I deserved better than a life constructed around someone else's convenience. The woman typing these words in her sunny apartment kitchen, surrounded by plants she's chosen and furniture that reflects her taste alone, bears little resemblance to the wife who once stood frozen on her front porch with anniversary Chinese food scattered at her feet. But she contains all the strength that woman possessed, refined by necessity and focused by purpose into someone Bob Thompson never imagined he was married to, and never will have the opportunity to underestimate again.